All right, so let me just, I think Dave did a pretty good introduction.
Oh, wait, something's on, like, it's
Oh,
something
see.
sitting, yeah.
I think, Dave sort of briefly explained what precipitated the movement to create this historic district, and that was really, it was really about tear downs. So just to give you kind of a lay of the land, this is the borough of Narberth. It's 1 square mile, right? It's
I thought it was less than that. I thought it was like a half square mile.
Is it a half square mile?
Yeah.
Okay, it's small, right?
And
I
it's
think
like 5,000
It's
people,
wow.
plus or
5,000
minus.
people, and completely surrounded by Lower Merion Township. But this this map sort of just demonstrates the properties that we're dealing with. Within the historic district, most of the property was pulled into the historic district. So it is a small community, but at least half of the buildings in Narberth or more are part of the historic districts. There are a number of non-contributing resources there, but the idea was to really provide a pretty broad layer of protection to the entire borough, because the built environment it dates to probably about the same time that Swarthmore was developed. It's a railroad suburb that took shape in the very late 1800s, and most of the borough was built out by about 1925. There are pockets of development that go through the, probably the 60s, right? But very small. So just, that gives you some idea of how much of the borough is covered by.
Yeah, we had started, actually, I think the original assumption for many of us with the borough being so small was, well, why don't we make the whole borough the historic district?
Yeah, I was gonna ask you that.
But there was, especially the people from the state, the Historical Museum Commission, felt that there was enough significant erosion of the fabric on the edges in along Montgomery Avenue and a few other places where there were so many non-contributing buildings, either because they were too new or because they had been significantly altered, that the application to the state for the district would be more successful if we took those out. And then we went through a fairly complicated process of trying to see how we exactly erode the edges of the borough
Yeah,
in an appropriate way. And that's what that first map was.
right. And this is just a selection of the kinds of buildings that you might see. So Narberth is mostly residential, but there are some areas of retail and commercial on its Main Street, and then also along the fringes on Montgomery Avenue. But it's the Main Street of Narberth that I only have one picture in here, but I mean it is similar in many ways to, I think, to the look and feel of Swarthmore's downtown, which is early 20th century. There are a sprinkling of buildings in Narberth that in the commercial area that date to the very late 1800s, but most of them are from the 1920s. And they, the architects that did a lot of the commercial buildings were the same architects that built a lot of the surrounding residential development in the teens and the 20s. So it was a very robust period of development in the 20s, as it probably was here too. A lot of the borough became like really filled out. So, let's see.
And I think the other significant thing is that there's probably not a single building that on its own would be considered architecturally significant enough to be considered, as worthy of preservation. I mean, we have a house on Montgomery Avenue that dates to 1803, which is a nice, early 19th century stone house, not particularly architecturally significant, but it's a nice survivor of when, Montgomery Avenue was one of the main turnpikes west. we have another house kind of buried on one of the smaller streets that reputedly has a log cabin buried inside of it.
No?
It's usually described as the oldest building in Narberth, goes back to the 18th century. But all the other buildings are on their own, I don't want to say nondescript, but probably not worthy of preservation in the sense that they're so, architecturally significant.
Yeah, and when this process started, really, I think it was a very organic kind of process where we were called in, and then there was a stakeholders group that was created that comprised people who had an interest in this. They had an interest in history, historic preservation, but also we brought in the people who represented the commercial interests in the town, realtors, just normal lay people who wanted to have a say in it. So it was a pretty diverse group of people that the Borough Council actually selected to help with this brainstorming about, first of all, what is it that we have in Narberth here? How do we define Narberth? How do we define the character of it? What are the tangible and intangible things about the borough that we care about and that people from the outside, use to define Narberth, people from the inside use to define Narberth, and then what is it at the end of the day that you actually want to preserve? So I think that the 4 years, and Dave, it didn't need to take 4 years. We were working with PHMC, and it was kind of a pilot program on their end. It's part of my job, but it's not part of the job of PHMC to do all of this legwork. We were the beneficiaries of sort of this new program that they were doing, where they were trying to figure out what kinds of tools could the state use, or what could be beneficial for for any kind of town. If you don't want to just borrow somebody else's preservation ordinance. You don't want to, which is what Lower Merion had done for a long time, and because it doesn't fit exactly what your needs are. So we're trying to determine what is it that you want, and this was a new approach from the state. So we worked with the state for a long period of time, trying to really just suss out what was available to the borough and then present that to the community. And one of the things that we found, I think, really useful, we actually created this heritage preservation plan, or it was this set of recommendations that was the culmination of a couple of years of work, where we asked our task force members to then reach out to the community through various surveys and Facebook and all sorts of things, the community groups, to try to get as much input as we could from the public. And working in historic preservation for as long as I have worked in it, I realized that if you're not totally transparent with your community, it can backfire. And I've made that mistake myself, making sure that people are always apprised of what's going on, making sure that people feel included and that they're educated about what these strategies and these regulations can and cannot do, because it can go downhill really quickly if you don't have the support of the community. And fortunately, in Narberth, I think at the end of the day, I think because of a lot of the outreach that we did, and because of the time that it took.
And I think too, a lot of it built on the process that we used for writing the form-based code, which also took way longer than it should have. I mean, that was like a 12-year effort. They rewrote the entire Philadelphia zoning code in less time than it took us to write the Narberth form-based code. But we not only spent a lot of time thinking about the form of the town when we wrote the code, but there was also a lot of outreach in that process. So we had kind of formulated the outreach kind of mentality that was then used to good effect for the historic district ordinance.
Yeah, so then after we created this plan, what came out of this plan was a set of recommendations that the state helped us to create, that sort of best fit what it was that the community wanted, and that was some, very low-hanging fruit, like better education, programs where people, if you've got materials from your old house and you're taking out your window, here's a place that you can recycle it, and here are some, we're doing workshops in the new year where we're talking about the repair of historic masonry and windows, and so if you're gonna talk the talk, you're gonna wanna walk the walk and make sure that people have access to the material that they need if they're interested in preserving their homes. There are not a lot of incentives no incentives really for the preservation of privately held owner-occupied houses or properties. You have National Register tax credits and so forth, but those are really out of the reach of most people. And so what it comes down to is really trying to build a sense of community and make people understand that Narberth has a sense of place, so that you feel proud about the place that you live, and you want to celebrate it. But then having to locate and identify what kind of strategies and tools do we have beyond sort of that carrot, because there's very little carrot there. I mean, there are lots and lots and lots of studies out there that try to assign economic value to historic preservation. But I think at the end of the day, we didn't think that was a way to sell the ordinance, because it's wrapped up in lots and lots of numbers and research, and it really comes down to what your own community wants and how palatable regulation can be. So the set of recommendations that came out eventually, the bottom line was that they recommended an historic district for the community, and following that recommendation, that's when you determine what the boundaries are and what is contributing and what it means to be a contributing resource. But as Dave said, individually designating a house wasn't going to do anything for the whole community. The whole, the sum of those parts is much greater than.
It's a fabric.
It's the fabric, right? And people definitely recognize that in Narberth, that, aside from the Price House, is there really anything that would merit individual designation? No, it was this collection of buildings. It was this pattern of development that represented the whole trajectory.
And the phrase that we heard very consistently from the old timers and newer people in the borough was, they wanted to keep Narberth, which is fine until you start to parse, well, what exactly?
What is that?
They want to keep Narberth until you tell an individual homeowner that they can't do something on their property. Then it gets a little dicier. So there was this very, very delicate balancing act, and it became clear, especially when we started to deal with the borough council, with the elected officials, and it entered into the political realm, that it was really the demolition that was the real hot point issue, and that the votes that we needed on council to pass the ordinance were much more skittish about being more draconian on the preservation issues. And I said many times in these meetings, if I was God, I would have had a much more intrusive ordinance about what you could or couldn't do to your house and the nature of the changes to it. But it became very, very clear to us that politically the votes were not there for that kind of an ordinance, and the political will wasn't there, and I don't think the public sentiment was there for that. And so the ordinance that got passed was much more focused on making demolition harder.
Yeah, and I mean, as a lifelong preservationist, I couldn't agree more with Dave. I mean, if I could have saved every old window, I would have, but I wasn't going to impose that on the rest of the community. Understanding also that the historic fabric in Narberth is more compromised, I think, overall than it is here. I would say at least with the residential,
Yeah, I think
you
so.
already have windows taken out, you already have vinyl siding, you already have most roofs that are asphalt already, you know, like.
I would
that
say the
changes.
majority of the properties
And-
in the town
So,
have been altered.
so putting an ordinance in place that even would have asked for, you know, a window that was compatible in terms of its Muntin profiles and all that, it seemed like a little bit too much for Narberth. And that was interesting, you know, for me to go through this process because this is a very unusual kind of ordinance that the state was okay with Narberth working with and approving, because it isn't that traditional ordinance that you see where you follow the Secretary of the Interior's standards. You know, you're really focused on the retention of historic material, or you know, looking at all of those rehabilitation standards. This was really very focused in on demolition. I mean, this is.
And there was also an interesting part of the discussion which really had to do with the era of significance of the
Yeah.
ordinance. You know, when we got started, I think the prevailing feeling was that, you know, 1945, the end of World War II, was a good stopping date. By that point, the vast majority of the borough had been built up, that the significance as a railroad suburb was pre-World War II, and it made sense to have that as a cutoff date. It turned out that there was a minority opinion that said, no. I mean, look, we have 1950s houses, you know, in parts of the town. We have even some 60s split level houses. We have a much more expansive story to tell about suburban development, which was a really interesting perspective, and one that I personally was not particularly opposed to, except it was clear, again, in the political realm, that Borough Council was not going to go beyond 1945. And they made that very clear to us, that they didn't think that that was politically sellable.
But we also continue to ask ourselves, is that when people talk about what Narberth is it the 1960s
Right.
houses? And, you know, we came to the conclusion that it wasn't. We're really looking at these patterns of development, like here in Swarthmore, what happened after the war? Well, garages start to become attached to the houses. You stop having front porches. You know, your setbacks are different. The sidewalks, the patterns of development, where you have you know, similar setbacks with the sidewalk, that's changed. You know, you have cul-de-sacs, which you don't have. So we were able to, I think, to really refine what it was we were looking for when we were looking for the period of significance. So 1945 ultimately became the date that we used. Anything outside of that, if it was on the boundaries, it was cut outside of the boundary, and then anything inside it became a non-contributing resource. But the state was very helpful, working with, you won't be able to see this, but this is sort of this typology of the kinds of ordinances that you have. So if you're just looking to regulate demolition and new construction, which is essentially what happened, you know, with our ordinance at the end of the day, you could go this way. If you're only looking for, if you're looking for real big picture changes, okay, you don't want to, you want to make sure that you don't rip off that front porch, the turret, things that are really those defining features. Here's something, here's another kind of ordinance. If you're really looking at the details, like you Nantucket or something, and you're really interested in preserving all of those very important contributing features, then you're looking at that kind of ordinance. So they created this sheet, and I can share this with all of you guys, where you're actually just literally going down this, like, it was very helpful, I thought, for us to, what is it exactly that you want to regulate? And so, do you want to regulate demolition? Do you want to regulate major alterations, architectural features and materials, setting and landscape, new construction, signage, and then delving even deeper into it, what among those features do you want to regulate? Do you want to regulate it on only contributing? Do you want to regulate it on non-contributing? So it really, I think it helped us to get a sense of what would be palatable at the end of the day, and allowing everybody to see these, and the Borough Council and the Planning Commission to really, well, what is it? Do we have, you know, are these, are windows something that we think are really, really important? And then, you know, we cross these things out as as we went through and wound up with this ordinance, which I think I've shared with you, Melanie, right?
Yeah.
That, defines the standards, and what can and cannot be done. So it is, as we've said, it's mostly a demolition ordinance. Any defining, feature, as determined by the HARB, would be, could be denied a demolition permit. So that would include things like the porches,
Removal of the front porches.
the turrets, these
Yeah.
big things, but taking out like
Yeah,
a window.
Changes to masonry openings, cutting new masonry openings, changing an existing masonry opening. That
But you could put in a vinyl window.
Did you set it so that you had like special exceptions? In other words, it was regulated by your ordinance, but people could come, in other words, it was allowed, but you still had a special exception where they had to present what it was that you wanted, to give a little bit of flexibility or to make an argument with the.
It wasn't a flat
about-
out denial. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
come before the board and you make that argument.
A HARB was set up, and for the process of doing exactly that there would be a forum that property owners could come to and talk about the scope of their changes, and there could be a discussion back and forth. Again, I think a lot of it had to do with the squeamishness of the elected officials, of
Right.
appearing too dictatorial about it.
Yeah, and additions are not regulated in this, which is, it's come back to, I think, there are unintended consequences.
Well, except again, we were building on the form-based
Right.
code, which was completely focused on additions and those kind of changes, in that they'd be designed in accordance with the code, which was, the code was designed around the existing fabric, in terms of roof lines and the percentage of opening to solid wall, roof slopes, bay windows, that kind of thing. So we were building on that form-based code model, which was written really more in thinking about additions than it was thinking about all of these issues. But the two ended up meshing together really pretty well.
Mhm.
Do you have guidelines, design guidelines?
No, we don't have design guidelines, but I think that is something that the borough is working toward or would like to get.
We talked about it. We really kind of fast forwarded this whole process when I think many of us got pretty panicked by watching the teardowns happen, and we said we got to get an ordinance passed, and we don't have time to screw around with all the niceties. We got to get something on the books, and we were just talking coming over. The last house that was built pre form-based code is now on the market, and it's this big hulking thing that's completely out of proportion with the neighborhood. And so there was a real desire. We had talked about design guidelines. I remember looking at several models, wanting to get that in there, but the real urgency was to get something passed and on the books first.
I think, it takes, money. Lower Marion Township, which, I said I also serve, they just passed a really comprehensive set of design guidelines. It was done by a firm called Friends and Friends. They do a lot of restoration work, right? So, and that was a sort of a long time coming, but very important component, and something that really we should have, because applicants come in and they don't, people who aren't, exposed to the language of historic preservation or historic buildings, it can be very confusing to be told that, you can't do this or you should do this, but not be able to see a visual of it. So I think that is something, as soon as Narberth becomes a certified local government, which is something that, you probably want to do if you're going to be creating any kind of preservation ordinance, because you get advantages and you get money from the state and things. So that can be really helpful to get grant money to create the design guidelines.
We are not a certified local. No.
Not that I, no.
With the post-World War II houses excluded, have they become targets of tear downs as a result?
Well, yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of the rationales in my mind in having the 1945 cutoff date was that if developers were gonna keep on circling around Narberth, I wanted to at least have some sacrificial lambs to throw them.
Yeah.
And I would rather they would tear down, a 50s, brick box than a nice 1920s bungalow. We haven't seen them swoop in and start to buy up those properties yet, because the other ones were too difficult to deal with because of the ordinance. But that was part of the rationale, at least in my mind, of having the 45 cutoff date, was that at least some properties would be left available that would be at least a little easier to tear down than the designated properties.
So on the flip side of demo, do you have any properties that are brand new and contemporary or modern that has to go through a non-design or a design
Well,
process?
there are,
Review process?
thankfully,
code.
there are a couple of examples of houses that were built, again, before the form-based code, that are, in my mind anyway, my humble opinion, glaringly inappropriate to the borough. There are only one or two. The newer houses that have been built since the code, and you can imagine what they look like. They have, typically the lick and stick stone on, and the dormers and the column porches. And I don't think they're particularly good. They're okay. They fit in. They don't look inappropriate. I wish the developers would spend a little more money, especially on the windows, which I find is the big failing of them. If they just get a nice divided light window, all those houses would look 1,000% better. But they're okay. I don't look at those new houses and go, oh my God, what happened here? It's just.
They're not reviewed.
Yeah.
There is
Yeah.
no
Kind of
review
blended.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they're non-contributing.
So we've talked
it's
a lot
the
about the
zoning code.
residential.
Yeah.
How did this manifest itself in the commercial?
Well, it's, we are, I guess we had three major construction projects in the borough. One was completed under the form-based code, but before the district ordinance. And two are under construction now, two mixed-use projects in the downtown, also under the form-based code. But because they were new construction, they did, obviously the historic district ordinance didn't apply. I think the form-based code did its job in that it wasn't intended to be a style book. We very intentionally did not want to dictate style. Said, this is what Narberth buildings look like. So the building that's already been completed, which is 56 units, which is a very large project for us, is probably more of what I would have done in terms of using a combination of brick and glazed brick and shingle, and kind of a broken up roof line. The two newer buildings that are under construction, designed by my first employer, Cecil Baker and Associates.
I know him well.
It was I was very happy when I saw he was the architect, because I felt
He's a
it was
good
good him. But it was much more modernist in its approach than the other building. And we've been watching it go up. They're framed up now and enclosed, so you can see the forms. And I'm okay with it. When I first saw the renderings, it got a little nervous. It wasn't really what, not what I would have done, but but I think in terms of the massing and the form and how he breaks down the volumes, I think they're gonna work.
We were there recently and we're surprised to see the big residential development that's on Forest Avenue.
Yeah,
It's just like.
Yeah, that was the first one,
That
yeah.
whole corner.
yeah.
So-
Bernardin was the architects there, and,
Bernardin?
yeah.
Who's the
But that was
architect for
before
this?
the code,
Yes,
or the new
Our
preservation.
friends.
Yeah, that was before the preservation ordinance.
yeah.
Were there any cultural considerations? It
Didn't-
seems like all of your, the code and all of your assessment of them was on aesthetics.
No,
Did
it
you-
wasn't. I mean, there was, I think, the deep desire to protect the, whatever affordable housing there is also in Narberth. And Narberth has a really nice collection of circa 1900 row houses. They're very Westphalian style and very diminutive. I mean, I'd say 1,000 square feet, maybe up on the north end of traditional neighborhoods that supported or accommodated a lot of the stonemasons in the area. So there was absolutely that. It's very dense communities. That was another thing. The ordinance, I think, one of the outcomes, I guess, is we're not just hoping to protect the aesthetic of Narberth. It's also, there are a lot of buildings in Narberth that have been split up into apartments. And so by creating a preservation ordinance that sort of disallows the demolition of those and construction of new housing, you save those, 5 to 7 apartments in these very large
Right.
Victorians.
I mean,
So that was one of the things that, one of the positives that we saw coming out of it, because, David mentioned the $1 million house. There was a house that was recently purchased, I was like 8 months ago, for 500,000 or 600,000, and it was sold for 175 something, right, on Woodbine.
yeah.
So that was increasingly happening, and people really wanted to maintain some level of sanity to allow diversity of, people to live there.
I mean, Narberth was built as a working class community for the main line. I mean, there were working class sections in Bryn Mawr and Ardmore, Kathleen knows about it far better than I do. But Narberth as a whole was the working class town there until, I want to say, the 80s, really heavily Catholic.
Yeah.
I mean, these tiny bungalows,
These kinds of things right here.
15, 13,
Yeah, you can
1,500
pass it around if
square
you want to
feet
see it.
bungalows had 6, 7 kids being raised in them, as But I think for many of us, me included, we wanted to live in that kind of a community. We didn't want
Right.
a community of live in the community of all the affluence that kind of surrounds us. And when we did all this, I think a lot of it was the fear that we were going to lose that sense of what Narberth always was. I mean, I see it just by the make of cars that are on the streets now. And we
We have that too.
we're hoping that
Exactly
the
what's
ordinance, really preserve. I mean, it broke my heart that my son couldn't buy a house, couldn't afford a house in Narberth. It just, we bought in Narberth in 1983 because it was, a place near the, walking distance to the train station that we could buy for under $100,000. And that just isn't the case anymore. So we very much wanted to keep the fabric of Narberth and those housing types that existed, which
Oh, those off? The
will, if not have affordable housing in whatever definition you want to use it, at least will never be such an opulent piece of property
These row
that
houses.
it's gonna go for $1 million.
So it sounds like just by so it's not like you directly address diversity or having
No.
affordable housing, it's just that it's as a result.
I mean, there
You've
was
got
a,
this,
yes.
like preserving
Yeah.
the houses,
I
but you
mean,
have the small apartments.
we've had this discussion many times in public meetings where, and I think there was a strong public sentiment for affordable housing. And I always say to that, I don't know what that means. I don't know how you define it in Narberth. The houses are small.
That's true here too.
I mean, even the new houses, in the terms of the main line, are small houses. You know, so there will certainly be a certain amount of self-regulation in that, you know, they will only, I thought sell for only so much money, but then that's kind of gone berserk. I'm hoping in some perverse, you know, I think my wife would kill me if she heard me say this, but I'm hoping that there will be, that we are in a bubble in the market and the housing prices will go down. You know, because it scares me. I mean, when I realized when that house that Kathleen just talked about, it sold for $1.7 million. I see that house when I go out of my house, and there was a nice, a nice 1910s.
Boyd and Abel,
Yeah, near, Knickerbocker
1,500
Boyd
square feet.
house, you know, with this beautiful stone chimney on the front, that was demolished for that house. And when that went down, I realized that none of our houses were safe.
Right.
Because nobody could resist, you know, cashing out and having a developer come in and tear down the house and build something else. You know, it was kind of real, you know, talking, I never thought about it in terms of a cultural awareness, but I think that's kind of a well put. There was a real cultural awareness of, again, trying to keep Narberth, and not have it become, I mean, it kind of, you know, freaks some of us out to think that how you know, desirable it's become. I mean, Narberth in the Depression was called Hungry Town. And even when my kids were growing up, being called a Narb was not a compliment in Lower Merion. And now it's, who knew that walkable communities were gonna become the thing, you know?
Pandemic, I think,
Yeah.
really drove that.
We did it because I needed to walk to the train.
Can you speak to the strategies for engaging the community and getting support? What worked, what didn't work, and
Mhm.
is that why it took so long?
None of it was easy. You know, as I was telling Allison, we don't live in, it's not a nirvana over in Narberth, and any kind of regulation, I think, when you set it up, it can be a challenge. And so, we really tried to monitor, the information that was circulating, and making sure that there were credible sites up that were giving people the official information that was coming from the Planning Commission or the task force, so that people didn't hear historic district and think that you couldn't change the color of the paint on your house, that you couldn't build an addition on your house because it has nothing to do with the historic district. That's the zoning code, and there was a lot of confusion about those two ordinances.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of outreach of telling people what it wasn't going to be as much as what it was going to be, because there was that real fear, you know, that all of a sudden there were going to be these style police telling you what you could do. And I think we have learned not only, you know, through the process of the form-based code, but with other, you know, political issues in Narberth, that transparency was really the way to go, that we had to be as open and transparent about the process as possible. I mean, Narberth, for all its good points, is still a very small town with all the very small town issues that come along with being a small, dense town, where everybody pretty much knows what's going on everywhere. And there are very, you know, very hot button issues that often deal with the open space. And we have some park space, which is, you know, a point of great debate and contention about what to do with it. And some buildings on that land that we need to decide what to do with. Fortunately, not contributing buildings, so it doesn't come into the ordinance. But, you know, but I think for us, the lesson in watching other previous issues and projects was that we just had to be very transparent about what we were trying to do and communicate through public meetings. We have some great resources in town. We have our unofficial historian who's worked for the Park Service for many years. Dennis gives wonderful lectures every couple of years on the history of Narberth. And there's a lot of interest in understanding. I mean, we spent an enormous amount of time in the Planning Commission talking about and talking to the public about why the porches are so important in the form of the town, even though many of them have been enclosed over the years. You know, we stuck in the form-based code religiously to the idea that open porches had to be part of the built form, you know, under the form-based code. And there was a lot of discussion and opposition to that, because that's the easiest way for many people in these small houses to capture a new room. And it's been so, you know, and there was a lot of vigorous debate. I mean, you walk down the street and 50-60% of the houses are already enclosed. What do you mean you're telling me I can't enclose my porch? You know, but there was this multiple discussions over years of describing why those porches are so important. And when somebody says, you know, I want to keep Narberth, why that particular piece of your house is keeping Narberth.
We also, like every step along the way, we tried to put out like an FAQ to answer questions, like immediately answer a question that was put out there, so that you had a very formal response from somebody on the task force or the planning commission or whoever officially was working on it, so that there wasn't as much of an opportunity for circulating, not even just disinformation. It's just people, where there's a vacuum, people step in just naturally to try to fill it. And also public meetings where we had, anybody was invited into the community room, was split up, and what is it about Narberth that you love, and like lots of Post-it notes and pictures and things
we did some
like
great
that.
workshops. We did some great workshops. We started with the form-based code, where we started with a few of the more prominent sites in town, and talked about, if this was open land, what would we do there in terms of the code? And we would get people, we'd have these charrettes, with the public, and like you guys, apparently we had enough architects around to be able to man the tables, but basically to hand the markers over. And I used to say, I'm not drawing, I do this every day, I'm not drawing tonight, you are. And to, to get down and to really think about what the form means. And then we translated that, when we got into the historic district ordinance, of doing the same type of thing. And now we're doing it with there's a little town square in front of the station circle. It's called now, it's trying to transition it to be called the town square, which was pretty badly redeveloped about 20 years ago. And we're now doing a new effort to take out all of that ill-considered renovation and have a new town square. And we did the same thing. We just a few months ago, had another series of workshops of rolling out big site plans on 4 or 5 tables of the station circle, with all the current stuff deleted out, and say, okay, what do you want here?
Another important thing that we did early on was just try to introduce the community to the history of the borough with visuals. And so we had a room full of people that, were really hot when they heard historic preservation, like, angry and worked up.
There's a lot of fear associated.
Well,
I don't know where this is, and
well,
it's here too.
It started with us.
Yeah.
There was a historic district ordinance, I think I would call it a historic preservation ordinance, that was written in the late 80s. And I was not part of the process of writing it, but others on the planning commission were. And it got, with the encouragement of council, it got to the point where this ordinance was written only to die once it got to council, because of this. Again, the word preservation was an inflammatory word. So when we started to write the form-based code, we were told explicitly, preservation is not a word you want to have anywhere near this code. And we, as I said earlier, we religiously avoided that. And so it was kind of ironic that once the code got passed, and then these teardowns started to happen, we started to hear why don't we have a preservation code?
There are other-
Because we tried for 12 years not to call it a preservation code.
I had a question.
Similar. Yes?
Uh, from the back. So just to kind of turn it on its head a little bit, were there any areas in Narberth where you were trying to encourage development? And so you were writing this code to try to maybe like transit-oriented development, trying to focus on that, as well?
I think that happened when the form-based code was created. With the preservation ordinance, it goes so far as to protect some of the larger brick apartment garden complex, the interior garden, and their 3 stories. That was something that Narberth felt like was really important to the character of the community. So even though some of those buildings are located along important transit lines, it was high density development that was already there. It was very worthwhile development, so that was meant. There was something that was identified as building that was worthy of preservation. I think with the new development, the ordinance does not prohibit demolition. It requires that the borough council make a decision. It allows the borough council to prohibit, but there are also kind of loopholes in it that provide borough council with opportunities to evaluate, especially I think when it comes to commercial, because we're dealing with this on the Main Street, Haverford Avenue, these are contributing buildings, but here's a list of criteria that would make them eligible for demolition. And if you can meet all of these, then, that's.
Do any examples, just.
Yeah, there is.
Well, there's a great example on the south side of Haverford Avenue, which is the main drag. We're unlike all the other mainline towns. We're fortunate that our main commercial strip is not on Lancaster or Montgomery Avenue, but it's on Haverford Avenue. So it doesn't have to deal with the volume and the traffic and the speed that Montgomery and Lancaster Avenues has. An awful lot of those properties are actually owned by a single landowner. And a stretch, a significant stretch of the commercial, of one side of the commercial street of Haverford Avenue is this completely nondescript one-story commercial building, which has less than no architectural character to it.
Is that where Mapes
It's just a box. And of course, its advantage is it's just a box. It's anonymous.
Yeah.
And when we were going through property by property, deciding whether they were contributing to the district, that building dated pre-1945. So it fell into the date of significance. Even though it had absolutely no architectural character, we put it in as a contributing structure just so it would have to go through the ordinance process when it was going to be redeveloped. Those buildings were not built particularly well. They're way past their expiration date. And there's a developer now who's actively coming up with designs that we've not seen yet for the redevelopment of that entire block of our main shopping district. Is going to have a huge effect on the borough. The other hot item, is density. You talk about density. I mean, you mentioned the project on Forest Avenue that had 56 units in it. Well, you would have thought it was 556 units by the hysteria about the traffic it was going to generate, even though the code required parking of 1 space per unit in the building. And I'm happy to say, and I live just up the block from it, the building's essentially fully occupied, and I've not seen any change in the parking patterns on the street. But the hysteria of these 3 mixed-use projects, you know, one built and two now under construction, about what that would mean in terms of the traffic. Oh my God, you'd think that the world was going, and, you know, in many times and this goes for this development that's being planned out on Haverford Avenue, I think that the density is good. I want people living in the downtown that are gonna go to the restaurants and they're gonna shop at the stores, and we're not talking about so many units that it's going to completely blow the parking situation. Again, the code requires on-site parking for these projects. You know, the other two projects under construction are relatively few units. I think it's like 15 and 18 units. The project on Haverford Avenue will probably be 35 plus or minus units, somewhere in that neighborhood. So you're not talking about hundreds of housing units, but you're talking about people that are living literally above the stores, because the form-based code requires that these projects be mixed use with ground floor commercial. That was something else we held on to very religiously when we were writing the code.
Allison, yeah, go ahead.
May I ask a question? With regard to the Haverford Avenue building that might extend to an entire block redevelopment, how is your ordinance handling that?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's gonna be very interesting, because we put all of those buildings as contributing structures
Right.
in the ordinance. There are two, some would argue, three buildings in that row that really should be preserved. Two of them are small brick structures that date to either the founding of the borough or even pre-1895, and I think really need to be preserved. The third one is an old A&P, which is still a food store for now. I think it's kind of nondescript. I probably wouldn't lose any sleep over sacrificing that to save the other two.
But isn't it
that's-
kind of a fabric? I mean, how do you
Yes,
tease apart
yes,
this
it's-
whole issue?
Continuity
It's,
of it.
That's,
You know,
I
these-
think it's a great question. I
these
mean,
are tough issues.
It's, you know, I worked in downtown Ardmore is also, it's a local historic district, and when I was on the Harb, for 9 years. They experienced a tear down of what's a class 1 contributing building there, and the argument was because, you know, the ordinance is not a prohibition on
Has no teeth.
on demolition. It's here that if you meet these criteria, you know, with there's economic hardship, and you have to prove through a number of means that, you know, you meet that criteria. If the building can't be used, it doesn't even, it's not even that you can't maximize the profit or maximize the resale of it. It's, look, you know, this in this case, this building in Ardmore that was torn down, the justification that the Harb used at the end of the day was that redevelopment here was actually gonna help the historic district, because the building that was there at that point, it was a Victorian that had 2 20th century storefronts, you know, appended to it. It had lost so much of its historic character. It was contributing, yes, it was built within the period of significance, but it had changed so drastically over the years that the tear down and the rebuild was something that was reviewed by the Harb, that, you know, you don't meet the same criteria for review, you know, if it's new development, but they're reviewing it with the idea of how this is going to impact, or what's the,
Precedent, wouldn't you?
well, there is
What
precedent,
concern?
but it's like, what is the, how does this affect, what's the effect of this new construction on the greater
character
historic
of it.
district?
I
Because they
mean,
felt like
the-
it was,
Yeah, I think it's important not to be naive about these things. If somebody is intent on tearing down a building in this country, chances are he's gonna end up doing it if they're dedicated enough to getting it torn down. I think what's worked for us pretty well is we have sent out signals, and some developers will ignore us, but a surprising high number work with us when we let them know that we want to sit down with them early in their project and hear what's important to them. And they hear what's important to us, and how can we, as trite as it sounds, have a win-win situation. And that's what's going on now with Haverford Avenue. And then the other project, the Price House, the 1803 house on Montgomery Avenue, has a large plot of land, which is also, and that property is being developed now. And we sat down with that developer as soon as we heard that it had been the Lankenau hamper shop for many years. As soon as we heard that the property got sold, we were able to sit down with the developer and talk about what did he need out of that property, and how he heard how important the Price House was to us, and how can we work together
It's a great idea.
to work the both ends. And like I said, some developers will not play ball with you, but we have found that, and we have enough of a track record now of a number of projects where we have done this, where the developers that we have generally come across will sit down with us. First of all, they realize that having a planning commission that's not immediately antagonistic, but is willing to work with you, will probably help you in the end get to where you want to be. And it's been not a completely successful process. There have been still times we've been a little blindsided by what developers end up doing, but for the most part, we have found that we were able to save the important stuff that we wanted to save, and we're able to find ways, if it meant getting these guys a few extra units or some relief on something else, that we were able to do that if they did what we wanted them to.
So it's a little back and forth.
Oh, yeah, and again, transparency is everything. I mean, the state, of course, has these sunshine laws. We have a couple of people in the borough that are actually fanatics about, they don't even like us passing each other on the street and saying hi. That we have to have these meetings out in public, and they have to, everything's recorded now, and
I know. All these things are-
and it's very, very, they're very rigorous about how many of us can get together at one time to talk about a project. But again, we've had very contentious meetings in the borough council over the years about all the kind of stuff going on in the back room. Whether it's true or not, it makes no difference. But there's a perception among, and you can imagine with our electronic environment, what it could be like, where these stories spread like wildfire. So again, transparency is everything of having these meetings in public, having these guys show up. Fortunately, we don't get that good of an attendance at planning commission meetings. So it's rare that we get 20 or 30 people who want to make public comments. But everything's out in the open, and when the comment comes up is, why am I only finding out about this now? The answer is, we've been having public meetings about this for 3 years.
Long time.
Do you have some kind of local paper?
Mainline Times, yeah.
I'll find
And
that up
is that something that really covers Narberth?
Look, I haven't read the Mainline Times in years. What do you?
Only if you knock on the door.
Yeah.
I contact the paper when I think things are important, or if there's something that's a reporter gets wind of that's like there's
Yeah.
going to be some controversy. But we disseminated the information through borough website, also through Facebook, Narberth Community Network. I don't know if you have those kinds of.
We have
Yeah.
But Facebook was a challenge because that's where a lot of the disinformation circulated. So that's why we kind of tried to have an official channel. But we use paper too. We posted things.
Yes, we did. We have bulletin boards, at the station, outside the post office, the Borough Hall. And I know when we did the charrette for for the district ordinance and again for the town square. All those were hard copies are actually posted up on bulletin boards, very retro.
And when we
Yeah,
created
we-
the stakeholder committee, my recollection is that, you know, the Borough Council really tried to choose people that they felt were, like credible resources, people who were, known in Narberth, to be, you know, good actors, so that whatever side you were on, that, you know, you were getting information from somebody who wasn't spinning in some kind of way, just that, there, you know, I think that none of the stakeholders were really heated in one direction or another. They were really just out there to study the information, collect and analyze it, and bring it back to us so that then we could, you know, we could filter it all and write a report,
Well,
your recommendations.
What I found, not only in those meetings, but more intensively for me was in my professional life. You know, much of our practice was working for nonprofit groups and religious institutions, and we would often have design charrettes, like with church or synagogue building committees, and open it up to the wider congregations about doing renovations and additions and those kind of things. And what we found consistently in doing those kind of things, and again in the public work in Narberth, was that people really just wanted to be heard. And even if their ideas were not incorporated into the project, the process of having an open forum where they could say what they wanted to say and that they felt that they were listened to, did a lot to kind of dispel the kind of anger and vitriol that you know comes out of these things a lot.
So-
Not all of it, but you know, a lot of it.
So, this has been great. I'm just gonna ask the group here. So, we have gone over really the time. I think we've all been, for us, because we're scheduled from 7 to 8:30, so I wanna be sensitive to that. And we do have some other things here, so I'm leaving it up to you. Should we continue here with asking questions? You know, how would you like to proceed? I mean, you're a wealth of
First thing we need
information.
is your email.
Yeah.
I have their contact information, they can distribute
And
it,
also-
along with what they'll send, which I don't have yet.
Also, we noted, I think at the last meeting, that we wanted to do a kind of follow-up field trip,
Right.
Right,
like
Yeah.
current,
Right.
so that we heard you and we got over there and sort of, you know.
Yeah, my
boots on the
understanding,
ground and
that's on
see-
Saturday? Is that?
We thought about that at the
We thought
last
about
meeting,
that,
but we
but
haven't
we
finalized.
haven't
Right, we
scheduled
did
that
Well, let me put
yet.
it
But we
another
wanna
way.
make it,
Yeah.
I'm happy to, I'm happy to,
right.
to,
We
you know,
wanna walk the
participate.
streets.
You know, I'd love to show you around and,
I've been surfing on Google Earth the whole time, so.
Yeah,
yeah.
So I think we should try to
Yeah.
at least come up with some reasonable time frame to do that.
I mean, it could be
Could be a
that,
couple groups too.
but also it could be out of this, maybe we have your email, is to put together a bunch of questions, maybe we send to Mal,
Right.
that, you know, from one person, from all of us, to continue this conversation, because I know we all have, I think we're trying to digest all
Right.
this information that is, it's funny, because it's like you're talking to, to Swarthmore. I mean, you know, this is the very thing, these are all the very same
Yeah.
things that we're kind of dealing with in the infancy, you know?
Yeah,
So, how does that sound to everybody?
Let's see, that makes a lot of sense.
Oh,
I mean,
Yeah.
I thank you so much for your presentation.
No,
It's
I
really
feel like
been
we've been like
terrific.
swimming in a stream and all of a sudden we're in a river. or
Right,
in the
right,
ocean.
right,
A
right.
lot of really good.
no, you know, I don't know why our process took so long, but as you could tell, you know, we really kind of got into it.
You actually did it when I was very actively going to workshops and everything, and this, you know, closer to 2000, to say 2006, people said, hey, you figure on 25 years to get a historic preservation